Hi, this is Akash.
Sayantan here, and this is Fans or Fanatics.
So, in the last episode, we were talking about how during the Bronze Age, the comic book industry took a turn towards dark, grim, and gritty from the playful and childish nature that they had during the Silver Age, and how the death of Gwen Stacy was the first big event in the comic book universe that gave some sort of stakes to the fight that had some real consequences. So let's see what happened after that and let's talk about that. And then DC came out with Crisis, I think, just after that, where Flash died, who is like one of the most important members of Justice League, Barry Allen Flash. And he literally died. He died trying to save the universe. And it wasn't like that he died and the next day he was back. Barry Allen Flash remained dead in the comic book universe for 25 years. So this really showed the world that yeah, the stakes were real. And in 1988, there's a funny story that in a Batman story arc that made comic history, right? So there was a storyline called A Death in the Family. In this issue, the second character who became Robin, Jason Todd, he was killed. So this is not important because there was a death, right? Because we have already seen those in previous issues of different other comics, as we were already talking about. Like there was death in Flash, like Gwen Stacy died, and so we have seen all those things even before that, before 1988. But this was important because something else. Robin's fate was essentially decided by the fans. Like at the end of the third part of this series, Robin was blown up by a bomb that was set by Joker, right? So at this time, the fans were asked to call in and vote for Robin's life or death. Like they had to call in and like today's reality show, do you want to vote this person out or keep him in? Like they were, it was like the first reality show ever on the pages of a comic book. And the death of Robin was decided by a margin of 72 votes. Like people who voted for the death of him were 5,343, and those who voted to keep him alive were 5,271. So there was a difference of merely 72 votes that killed off Robin, the boy wonder. So comic books are opening new doors during this time, and it's the age of invention, and the less they started caring about the censorship, the more they became innovative. Like in the 1970s, I think we were also talking that day about collaborative adventure stories between Green Lantern and Green Arrows, right? Where they were fighting against different problems that were in the society back then.
Again, it was a great time for invention, and comic books were slowly, coming back in the graces of the mainstream media. Very inventive during that time. They were experimenting, and people loved it. People were reading comic books again. They were getting back in the graces. Sales were catching up, and there was some mainstream appeal also. Batman movies were coming out with Michael Keaton playing Batman, Tim Burton as the director. We had Christopher Reeve playing Superman. So they were there. And I think if we talk about the comic book history, comic books reached a very high peak, and like anything which reaches a peak, there is a bubble which bursts. And 90s was the time for that, when like comic books came to be seen as collectibles, and that was something we will, I think, talk about in later episodes about how the market crashed. But 90s were definitely a dark time for comic books, and we can see anywhere in the media, like we had movies like Martin Scorsese and Godfather, they're being phased out. We are having more and more action movies, blockbuster movies, and that same culture was replicated in comic books. We have the 90s dark age,
Marvel Comics almost became bankrupt.
because what happened is that you have Frank Miller and Alan Moore. They were having this great comic books which are for adults, and suddenly people said, how can we push the envelope? How can we make it more dark, more for adults? And suddenly they had no limits. So it was a bad time for in quality very much during that time. I think post the silver age of comics, after Seduction of Innocence in the 90s were another big blow to the comic book industry. it was during that time I think that it was the start of comic books actually again getting back in the mainstream media where characters like Blade, you had Spawn getting movie adaptations, right? And I think that is slowly the age where the media adaptations of comic books were much more popular for the first time than the comic books themselves.
Like I think that was really a age of anti-heroes, like as we call them, where dark, pessimistic stories were really popular. Like in Alan Moore's Watchmen, there was a world that looks down upon the superheroes that they all once admired. In Frank Miller's Batman, The Dark Knight Returns, Batman was over 50 years old and he had retired from crime fighting, and the criminals are terrorizing Gotham like anything. I think that was the time when readers witnessed the death of Superman in Superman versus Doomsday. Batman was critically injured in Nightfall. I think other non-superhero comic books as well at that time. Like one of the most important name that is coming to my head right now is Mouse by Art Spiegelman. I don't know what's the right pronunciation for that. That won the Pulitzer Prize. Like comic book winning a Pulitzer Prize was really, really a strong step towards that, the recognition that that industry deserves. But simultaneously, as we saw a growth in creativity and quality of stories and the nature of storytelling, we also saw a slump in sales that completely blew the comic book industry to grounds at that point of time. Like Marvel during the 1990s, I think the late 1990s were totally bankrupt and they had to sell their major characters. Like, there's a funny story. They approached Sony with the idea of selling their entire library. And the director of Sony at that point of time, he said, "We only want Spider-Man. We don't want the rest of those shits." And now we know, like, that was not really a good move. But at that point of time, only Spider-Man was the one that was selling out. Like Avengers were nowhere popular. I think the advent of movies, I think you would agree, is something that had invariably like increased the popularity of comic books as well. Coming of movies, like you had Superman in the 70s, then you had Batman in 1986, and then later on, there after I think Batman and Robin, there was a steep decline. The failure of that movie almost acted as a curtain calls for that particular genre of movies. Again, in the 21st century,
Yeah, you can talk about Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, right? And I think that's a movie trilogy. Like at least the first two movies are very much close to our generation because like you had Batman, you had Superman movies, but those are old movies before your time. When Spider-Man came out, the CGI was like nothing we have ever seen before, and like actually seeing a live action movie of your favorite cartoon character during that time because you were not aware of the comic book medium that much. That was a huge thing, and I think that was a huge shift for the industry as well.
like having a live action movie felt like a stamp of approval. Like cartoon was supposed to be for kids, those were meant for kids, but when you have a movie, it was like, no, this is for everyone to see, right? So I think the movie industry plays a huge role in changing this mindset about comic books, that it is just for kids, with the coming of obviously the Sam Raimi Spider-Man. Although I think it is one of my favorite superhero movies, Spider-Man 2, but that Spider-Man series, except for Spider-Man 3, which tried to be a bit dark, the first two movies were essentially for kids, right? But then Christopher Nolan came into the picture and he completely changed the idea of like superhero movies. Up until now, there were good superhero movies, there were bad superhero movies, right? Spider-Man 2 is a good superhero movie. Spider-Man 3 is not a good superhero movie. But with the coming of Nolan, we stopped defining them as superhero movies. They were like good movies with superhero characters in them.
I agree with that. Like suddenly you have, people talking about these movies in the same breath as you talk about any other crime movie, any other drama which is going on during that time. That was a very important thing for the medium. Not only that, the mainstream approval the Dark Knight movies got. like even the recognition it got from so-called serious industries like the Oscars, the Golden Globes, or any of the critics and the
Mm,
reviews, that helped
mm.
the industry a lot. And not only that, it also showed movie developers, the production houses, that you have a treasure trove of source materials to dive into. And if we talk about many movies, right, like you would be surprised to know that they were actually like based on comic books, like 300.
Exactly.
Yeah, then we had History of Violence, Road to Perdition,
Sin
Kick-Ass,
City.
Wanted, Sin City, V
These
for
are good.
Vendetta. Yeah, these are just good
These
movies,
are good
period.
movies.
Huh.
Right.
And I think that was very important to realize that many people don't understand that comic books are not just for, superheroes.
Yeah, like they were good movies first, then superhero movies second, comic book movies second, right? 20 years back, like in 2001, 2002, at that time, like before the coming of Dark Knight, people would laugh you off if you told them that two actors will win Oscars for playing the character Joker. Jack Nicholson in 1985, he gave a brilliant performance. He's still one of the better Jokers that I have seen, right? But still, there was a barrier that was broken. It was treated as a movie first and then a genre movie second. That I think has played a huge role in changing the mindset of people as a whole toward this comic book industry in general. That is a great segue to our next topic of discussion that we really want to talk about is comic books beyond superheroes, right? Like as I said during the beginning of our discussions, when I hear the term comic book, the first thing that comes to my mind is superheroes. And I think that is true for vast majority of the population around us, right? Even those who have read a lot of comic books. But there's a huge world in comic book beyond this DC Marvel, or even within this DC Marvel, there are stories or there are characters that don't necessarily fall into the realm of superheroes, and they're good stories first. Let's talk about some of them. What are your favorite non-superhero comic books?
So, like I was a huge Vertigo mark for people tuning in. DC Comics thought about having a separate imprint for mature comics. They had a great staff of writers on their payroll, and they wanted these writers to have the freedom to tell any kind of story which they want to do. And
Uh,
that thing where they had the separate imprint called Vertigo Comics, where you had first class writers, authors like Neil Gaiman, you had Alan Moore, you had Grant Morrison. So you had these people writing comics, like you had Preacher, you had, of course, comics like Swamp Thing and Sandman, which were like on the fringes of the DC universe and later become something else entirely. So if I talk about my favorite comic book, yeah, one of the first non-superhero comic book which I read was 100 Bullets. That was the first non-superhero comic book which I read, other than Watchmen, of course. But again, Watchmen I considered a superhero
Watchmen.
book. Yeah, yeah. But
Yeah.
if so, 100 Bullets by Brian Azzarello and Eduardo Russo. That was like a great crime. Like I love crime stories, and it is still one of the best crime stories which I have had the pleasure of experiencing in any medium. Other than that, Sandman is a perennial classic. I believe Akash is going through Sandman right now, and apart
Yeah.
from that, we have Preacher. We had comic books like Fable,
You have
Hellblazer, as you like many people might not
Hellblazer.
know. Yeah, John Constantine.
You have Invisibles by Grant Morrison. Then you have V for Vendetta, which is also a Vertigo print by Alan Moore. And that is, I think, the first non superhero comic book that I read. And for a long period of time, I did not know that a movie existed, right? So I was a big fan of the book. So when people used to talk about V for Vendetta, which is a great comic book, it was set up in a dystopian London where political dictator has taken over, a fascist kind of a dictator has taken over the entire of London, and he has imposed a strict regime, and there is a character called V who is trying to fight against that regime, and the idea of revolution, the revolution never dies. So that was a political satire, that was a comic book essentially. So it really caught my attention and I really liked it. And Whenever people used to talk about V for Vendetta, I assumed that okay, they are talking about the comic book, and I felt very good. Okay, I also read it, but then later I saw that there's a movie starring Natalie Portman, which is what people usually mean when they talk about V for Vendetta, and I had this huge luck. Like one of the biggest fanboy moment of my life happened at Mumbai Comic Con. I went and I met David Lloyd, who was the artist behind V for Vendetta. And he has also drawn for Hellblazer. And he drew me a sketch of John Constantine and gave me a signed copy of V for Vendetta. That is like one of my most treasured collection that I have, rather. So that was one of the first comic book that I read that was not essentially a superhero book.
Like a Comic Con is something which I would like to visit. Like I don't know, the next Comic Con might be in 2023 or 24, whenever. But
Like a San Diego Comic Con, right? Like going to that panel, meeting someone like Frank Miller or even Geoff Jones, like modern legend.
and I think that's why, like, the community in India mainly, we have not had that much opportunity to meet this kind of people. There's something like people interested in this comic books, science fiction, video games, people staying in like USA, right?
Yeah.
They have a number of things. They have an entire industry revolving around the fan base.
I think that fandom comes with association. Like as a Bengali, we love Rabindranath Tagore. Why? Because like since we were born, we have been introduced to him in some form or the other, right? Through his music, through his poetry, through his art, through his movies, or he's imbibed in the culture of us. Like any Bengali at least knows the name of Rabindranath Tagore and knows some of his famous works, right? And as you were saying, that comic book industry, we don't really have that kind of a cultural relationship with that has deprived us from that exposure, as you can say. And I think that is hugely responsible for the distance that has been created the Indian comic book audience. That is, I think, surely growing now in a large number, but it still has a long way to go, right?
Yeah, it's a long way to go. And even like if you go to the Comic Con, you have wonderful Indian authors and artists, drawing. Like I remember I read one comic called Ramayana, I think, 3000 AD, something like that. That was like a science fiction based on Ramayana. Wonderful art, wonderful concept. So, like we have had good authors coming up. Like if you don't know, Ram V is one of the finest authors coming up in the industry, the mainstream comic book industry, an Indian. He is writing the recent arc of Justice League Dark, and he had his own Image Comics, which great in comics based on Indian culture and society. And I believe that Indian audience is still very much enamored with the superhero comics. So I think it is important for any culture to grow that you have to support comics or the like any artist of your locality, of your culture. And that's something which I actually can see people moving towards that. So I have high hopes for the industry.
Yeah, like when we were kid, comic was something essentially for kids, right? It wasn't something like your dad would read. But now we are in our
Now we have people
20s
like
and
us, yeah, people like us, like if I go back and like if I get a chance to write Batman, for example, I would love to do that, but again, I would bring my own modern sensibilities into it, right? So I think the fans growing up and becoming the creators of products, that is nothing like it. And since we have such a, I think the number of people consuming this culture of comic book, the superhero things, even from countries like India, would result in a huge number of our people getting up to the pedestal and actually writing for the big companies.
and that really helps the comic book industry as well, right? Not just us as consumers. Like we would be exposed to contents that are great in quality and huge in quantity, right? We would be exposed to a world that is
Like, people, that's why diversity is so important in anything, because diversity like has become a buzzword nowadays. But again, like when people try to bring in diversity, because people have different experiences, and different experiences lead to different kinds of stories. And we have such an unlimited potential of telling stories. So, in the future, that is only going to enrich the comic book medium. And as a fan, I can't wait to see what's in store.
The only thing that when someone think about comic book, the names of two publications basically comes to our mind, like Marvel and DC. There's a lot more beyond that, a lot more. There are Image Comics, there are Vertigo Comics. Vertigo is still a brand of DC, and Image was formed by people who were not happy at Marvel, and they went away and formed a different brand. And apart from that, there were Dark Horse Comics. There is Diamond Comics, which is an Indian company that publishes comic books. There is Amar Chitra Katha. There is a brand called Ace Comics that publishes mostly online comics, which are not featured in big name brands. Those are written by generally new writers and new artists, and you might get to read someone's initial works who might later on in his life go on to write something like a Watchman, which becomes a classics. Yeah, I have a lot of hope for this industry, as I can say. Being a fanboy, I really want to see more people into this.
See, we already have more people like us. That's something which I think I remember when the Marvel movies were coming out, right? Even they would be coming out, but it was like they already prepared for it now. But then, like I remember, so when I was doing my MBA, right? I had one of my batchmates. He saw the first Avengers movie, Infinity War, and Endgame was still 1 year away from releasing, and but he was excited that I need more. And I remember he comes up to me and says, Sayantan, I need some source material to go through. And I have, like, he's not that kind of guy. I don't think he has read comic books. But suddenly I found myself suggesting him an Infinity Gauntlet. And I remember he read through it, then we had a discussion on it. Even now, people have just started talking about it. Maybe they have not yet, not many of us actually go back and go through the actual source material, because as you know, reading as a concept is dying away. Like, people are not even reading books. Comic books are a different beast altogether. But I believe that audience is surely gonna grow, and as the medium is evolving, as more and more different kinds of stories are being told, you will have more and more different kind of people getting in. You will have more people relating to it, more people relating to their cultures, and the audience is surely going to grow. And not only have hope for the comic book industry, but also for this podcast. What we had today was a much more free flowing discussion about our influences and how we got into.
Let's say this was like a first step for us, because this is something that is totally new to us. Yeah, we have been talking about comic books for like 7 years now, if I'm not wrong, 6, 7 years.
We are expecting to deep dive into some of the topics which we have discussed today.
As I was saying, when we were talking about characters that we like, we can take Batman and just talk about him for hours.
Like, we can just talk about not on Batman. We can have one episode for Batman comic books, and we can have one for Batman animated. We can have one for Batman movies.
And I hope this receives a lot of love and support so that we can keep doing that, because at some point, if you don't get some sense of appreciation, you lose interest. But yeah, we will still keep on talking about comic books, but maybe we would upload them on internet, seeking for validation from strangers. So, if you liked us so far, give us a like, subscribe to our channel, and we'll continue this in the next episode. Thanks for tuning into Fans or Fanatics.